Exactly how much realism do we really need in Dungeons and Dragons? What are the best ways to create wilderness encounters? And what exactly is Snit's revenge? We're going to find out all of this and more today on Daddy Roll the One. Just wanted to do a quick little promotion for a friend of mine, Lost Legacies Gaming, who has a new Kickstarter happening for an old school themed fantasy role-playing game and setting is how they describe it. It's called Immortals. And what makes it different is that it is inspired by old school games. And one of the things, though, that it does is it will eventually include rules for playing immortal type characters. And it does handle combat and damage and spellcasting a little bit differently than a standard game. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff in here, though, that you could probably grab and use in your traditional old school games if you don't want to play the setting as is. But one of the things that I really liked about it was the art that's in here. So there's just some really cool old school art that they've already paid for. So it's already part of this. And so that's what the Kickstarter funds are going for mostly, is to kind of try to and help recoup some of the expense that went into the art and then get some professional editing and layout. But it already looks really, really cool. And you can see some more of the art here. If you follow old school gaming at all, you'll recognize a lot of these names. But it's got an adventure as part of it. It's a box set, comes with 3 booklets. And the third booklet is the adventure itself. And then there's like some cool stretch goals. So it is about a little slightly over halfway there. There's 22 days to go. So I would encourage you to check this out. I like to encourage new creators in the game. As you know, I just recently ran my own Kickstarter. It was my first one ever. And, we want more of that kind of thing in our community rather than just the same corporate stuff that's continuing to come out. So definitely check this out. There's going to be a link in the show notes below. And if you have the means and it looks interesting to you, I would recommend checking it out. Thanks. Hello there and welcome back. I'm Martin. And this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. It's also part of my sub-playlist or sub-series, however you want to say that, on the history of Dragon Magazine. And the reason that I cover this is really because looking at these issues of Dragon Magazine is looking through the history of how Dungeons & Dragons came to be played and designed the way that it is now over the course of the past 50 years. So many things that especially modern players, if you started, let's say, in 3rd edition and beyond, that you might take for granted as just being part of the game, actually debuted in Dragon Magazine. So things like barbarians, the barbarian class, we've talked about that before. Cantrips, which have been part of D&D since at least 3rd edition, like part of the core rules, we'll say, since at least 3rd edition. Debuted in Dragon Magazine. They weren't always part of the game. Monsters like the Remoras or Remoras, however you want to say that, the Ankeg, those are iconic D&D monsters that debuted in Dragon Magazine. So looking back at the magazine, and it's not just the mechanics either, it's also the philosophy of the game and what people found important. And at the time, TSR used Dragon Magazine almost as like market research because, there was no internet to share ideas on. There was no, user boards or like all that kind of stuff. So the way that you built this community was that you had these magazines or fanzines or whatever. And, Dragon was kind of the big 800-pound gorilla of them. But the people writing in and saying like what they didn't like, what articles they didn't like or why they didn't work or whatever, or conversely saying, I did like these articles. This one was great and I used it in my game. Or just the authors themselves, amateur writers that wrote in with an article that got published, was showing the people at TSR what was working, what wasn't, and what people wanted to see. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to continue to look at these early issues of Dragon Magazine, because it really helps put the whole hobby, not just Dungeons and Dragons, but the entire tabletop role-playing game genre into context of what was happening at the time and how we got to where we are now with the way games are currently being designed and played. So, when I talked about in my introduction, I picked 3 specific things because I sort of thought those were the things that people would be most interested in coming out of these issues. So the whole bit on realism and D&D, I will tell you right now, it's a very quick little article. I think the title is more evocative than the actual content, but I do want to talk about it because that was a topic that was coming up at the time. How realistic do you want your games to be? And it's a topic that people still talk about today. Snit's Revenge is probably the biggest thing out of these 3 issues that people have asked me to cover, and that has been talked about before in other channels. And I never played Snit's Revenge, but I want to cover it in the context of this. And then there's a bit about wilderness encounters. There's a whole section that's probably my favorite section of these 3 issues about D&D variants and like DM advice. And so very, very early on, we're seeing those types of articles come to the forefront because people wanted to run better games and they wanted help. They wanted to know what they could do to make their games better. And so you start to see Tim Kask, the editor-in-chief of Dragon Magazine, he's collecting these articles and he published them all in kind of like one little chunk here. And that is my favorite part. However, I'll just be quite honest. I didn't think that was enough to get people to watch the video. I think people probably are going to tune into this more so for the history aspect. And so that's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about the creators and what else they went on to do later on, if anything, in the role-playing game world or beyond, and then talk about some specific concepts again that we're going to see repeated as we get into later editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so let's dive in and start talking about Dragon Magazine issue number 8. Now, normally I only cover 2 issues of Dragon in these videos. However, this time I'm going to do 3, and that's because in issues 8 and 9, there is a short story. It starts in issue 8, it continues in issue 9, and it takes up a substantial portion of the magazine's pages, about a third, at least in issue number 8, and probably about the same in issue number 9. So because of that, I felt I could go through these a little bit quicker and cover more than just the 2 issues. So we have this very colorful cover here. This is by artist Bill Hannon, who you remember before if you've watched my other videos on Dragon Magazine. He did the cover of Dragon Magazine issue number 1, and he was Tim Kask's art teacher when Tim Kask was in school. So that's kind of where that connection came from. Tim Kask, as you hopefully remember, at this period in time is the editor-in-chief of Dragon Magazine. He was actually hired to help edit the Strategic Review, which was the precursor publication to Dragon. And then he ended up transitioning Strategic Review into 2 different publications, Little Wars and Dragon. Then he took over editor-in-chief job of Dragon. Okay, so we're going to go in here to our first little spread here. So inside front cover on the left is an ad for Star Empire. So if you watch my other videos, hopefully you saw the one where I talk about Star Empire. So I know the thumbnails that YouTube lets you test 3 different thumbnails now. So that also means that coming here to watch this video, there's a chance that, you saw one of the 3 before it was decided, but it automatically will test them and see which one people are responding to more. And so in my video on Star Empires, I also talked about Star Frontiers, and that was the image that most people clicked on. So that's the thumbnail that you'll see now in that video. But Star Empires was a game that TSR published many years before Star Frontiers. And it was the middle part of it was intended to be a trilogy of games. It started with Star Probe, then Star Empires, then it was going to be, I think it was Star Masters. And Star Masters was never published. And then it was scrapped. And then later on, Star Frontiers came out, and a lot of people that are close to it and have seen drafts of Star Master think that Star Frontiers was basically, I don't want to say a copy, but it used a lot of ideas that were in Star Master. That was by John Snyder, and he was part of the Blackmore crew. And so there was thinking that maybe, TSR kind of wanted to push those people out because by this point in time, Dave Arneson has left the group, and there's a little bit of bad blood between him and Gary Gygax. At this period in time, this is the mid to late 70s. And so, one of the theories is that they didn't want to publish another game by John Snyder because he was a Dave Arneson guy, not a Gygax Lake Geneva guy. So I don't know if that's true or not. That's all speculation, but be what it may, his third game was never published and Star Frontiers was. So if you want to learn more about that, please watch that video. I had a lot of fun putting it together. There's a lot of great history in that one. I'll put a link to it up here. Okay, so now over here on the right-hand side, we have Dragon Rumbles. And this is where Tim Kask talks about, this is his editorial piece. So I'm going to just, increase the size here a little bit so that we can see what he's talking about, just make it easier to read. And so he talks about this work by Harry O. Fisher. That's the short story I'm talking about. So Harry O. Fisher was a companion comrade of Fritz Leiber, who created like the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser characters for the world of Netwan, like Lankmar and all that kind of stuff. So people say that Fafhrd was the taller of the two, kind of like the barbarian type. He was based on Fritz Leiber or Lieber. And then the Grey Mouser was based on Harry O. Fisher, who kind of more was like a slighter in stature, and that he kind of matched that character a little bit more. So they're both very fundamental to those characters. It's just the name that everybody seems to know is Fritz Leiber, but Harry O. Fisher was almost as famous. And you can see down here at the bottom, it talks about how he's going to be a guest along with Fritz Leiber and Gardner Fox, who we've talked about before at Gen Con 10. So Harry Fisher also helped Fritz Leiber develop the Lankmar game that was first published in 1937, and then they worked on it again, and it was published by TSR. We've talked about all this before in the kind of like mid to late 70s again. So a very important person. That's why this story was such a big get and why it takes up so much real estate in this magazine, because he was a very famous, science fiction or fantasy and sword and sorcery author. Okay, then it talks about the cover again by Bill Hannon. We already talked about that. And then he talks about what's not going to be in here, which is the Gnome Cache, that ongoing story. He talks about how Phineas Fingers, he can't get a hold of the creator. If you recall, the Phineas Fingers creator, JD, was in the Navy. And so a lot of times I think he was just not able to get his work done on time because he had other duties that he was attending to. So he also talks about the cartoon Dirt, and then he jumps all the way to talking about a game he talks about a game that's going to come out in issue number 11. So he skips past 9 and 10 really and just jumps right to that. And then he talks about a story that's going to be by Fritz Leiber coming out in issue number 11. So that's kind of like the main part of this editorial here. And then he says it's convention season, and so they're going to be late delivering this, and if they are, like, give them some slack. This is essentially what the point is of that. Now we see here the staff artists are Dave Sutherland and Tom Wam. So now they have two staff artists. Normally we've just seen one, and it's been Dave Sutherland, but now we see two, and then again we see that the cover was by Bill Hannon. All right, so I'm gonna shrink that back down, and we're gonna go to the next page spread. Now I would say, other than Snit's Revenge of these 3 issues, at least in this specific issue, number 8, the most hands down famous article is this one here on the left, Planes, the Concepts of Spatial, Temporal, and Physical Relationships in D&D by Gary Gygax. Now, I'm not going to talk about this because I have talked about it before a couple of different times. I talked about it briefly when I covered the Best of Dragon Volume 1. Because this article was reprinted in that. And then I also did a deep dive in this in my video series. I have a 2-part series on alignment and the planes in D&D. I'm going to put links to that up here. They'll also be down in the show notes. But that's where you want to go to see what this article is about. But this is the first concept of the planes developed for D&D, where Gary starts working out ideas of what the planar relationships are and what all these different planes are and what their alignments are. And that's why alignment and planes, I tied them together, because the two concepts are linked. And so that all comes out in this particular article, where you start hearing about like the prime material plane and the astral plane and the evil planes and the abyss and all that kind of stuff. It all comes from this article. But again, watch those other videos to learn more about that. Now over here on the right, we're going to see an article called The Development of Towns in D&D by Tony Watson. Once again, I did cover this very briefly in my coverage of Best of Dragon Volume 1, but I did want to remind people, this article is fantastic if you are a DM running a town or a city or a village campaign where that's your home base for your players, which it usually is, right? You usually have some kind of village that you return to after you've gone on your big adventures. You want to have that home base. And this article has, I don't think, any mechanics whatsoever. You can use this with any edition of D&D, and I've come back to it time and again. Now I first encountered it in Best of Dragon Volume 1. Back in like probably the mid 80s, I'd say 84, 85 is when I finally picked up a copy of that. But I use it all the time. So there's just great ideas in here. And I would highly encourage you to check this out if you can. Now, Tony Watson wrote quite a few articles for different publications over the years, including Dragon, but also Ares Magazine, Different World, things like that. He did cover a lot of science fiction type games like Star Frontiers and things like that. So that was the majority of what I could find is his tabletop role-playing game adjacent career is writing magazine articles up through at least the mid 80s. If not a little bit longer. I think the last one I saw was Dragon Magazine number 93, and that would definitely been mid 80s. So this particular, issue number 8 we're talking about, this is July of 77. So he was writing for not quite a decade, unless he wrote more, and I just don't know about that. Now, I did want to point out, I like to point out the ads because, again, they're part of the tabletop role-playing game history, and it's so interesting how different advertising has changed based on the formats that we have now and what we can do. And you can hyper local target, you can geo target with the internet that you couldn't do in print. This is a national or actually even international magazine. There's people reading this magazine that lived in Germany and Canada, things like that. And yet you have this game store in Southern California in Burbank called The Last Grenadier. So I remember seeing ads for The Last Grenadier in Dragon when I was a kid, and seeing that it was in Burbank. And to me, and I knew that the Tonight Show, back when Johnny Carson hosted, because that's when I would have been watching this, I knew that was in Burbank because they mentioned that. And to me, that meant Hollywood. I mean, it's adjacent, but if you don't know where Burbank is, it's kind of between, I'd say it's between Pasadena and Hollywood. I live in Pasadena, but so when I moved to Los Angeles, or the LA area, I had kind of forgotten about Last Grenadier, and then I got reminded of it, and I realized it wasn't that far from where I lived, and I went out, and I made a couple trips out there. By the time I went, it wasn't where it's listed here, this Golden Mall address. It was on Olive, if I recall. I think it moved a few times. And then the last time I went, it had moved again, and I forget where it was, but it was just a whisper, a shadow of its former glory. And it was right before it closed, and it was a real letdown. And I blogged all about that on my blog. I'll put a link down there if people are just interested. It's a huge piece of gaming history, this Last Grenadier. It's a shop that people were aware of because they read Dragon Magazine, and this ad was in there going to this international audience. So this is the continuation of the article on towns. And then again, we've seen this ad a few times now, this Nomad Gods for Chaosium. All right. And then you have down here, tiny little ad for Lyle's Hobby and Craft Center in Westmont, Illinois. All right. Now, this is the start of that story. It's called The Finzer Family, A Tale of Modern Magic. And it is really fun. It's a fun story. Decades before something like a Harry Potter comes out, the idea of wizards in the modern world casting spells. And that's really what this is. It's a magical family, and it talks about all the family members, and they have all these abilities and their responsibilities for using them, and trying to not be caught and things like that were all part of this story. So it's pretty fun. It's just it's fine. Tim Cass made a decision to have this story take up 11 out of 32 pages. So, minus there's some ads and stuff, but still, it's a substantial portion of the real estate in this issue to cover this particular story. But again, it's because I think the thought was getting Harry O. Fisher was a big deal, and that people would perhaps buy this magazine just because he did a story in here. And in fact, if you see on the cover, that's the lead thing that they put up here, is that story is in here. Okay, so this is the continuation of the story. Now, these this artwork, I believe, was also done by Bill Hannon. So these little portraits. Okay, then you've got your ad for D&D 25 millimeter fantasy figures. We've seen this ad before, so I'm going to skip past that. And we've seen this one before by Fantac. This was probably their most famous game. They had a couple, like a few, maybe 3, something like that. This is the one I think most people remember. And I think partially that's because they advertised it in Dragon Magazine. Probably elsewhere as well, but, this is where I saw it. So the story is continuing here. You can see what I'm talking about in terms of the length. Now, this is a giant full-page ad here by Judges Guild, and you can tell it's fun to watch their ads in Dragon because you can see over time, and it's like issue by issue, their ads are getting bigger and bigger because they have more products to sell. And the reason they had more products to sell is because people were buying their products so they can make more, so they could buy a bigger ad. And it's kind of like a, self-perpetuating thing here. But you start to see all this breadth of products that they have, and they specifically talk about TSR, and it's combined with TSR's popular Dungeons and Dragons. So they had approval to do that. They'd gotten approval from the company, and they've got some reviews down here from people. So really fun, because Judges Guild was a huge part of D&D history in terms of creating, adventures that people still play today. Goodman Games is doing one right now. I think it's going on right now. I might have just wrapped up for one of the ones like Caverns of Thracia, which was, a very popular adventure for Dungeons and Dragons, but not published by TSR. It was published by Judges Guild. Okay, so that's the end of this particular story. So you see here, and it says to be continued in TD as a reminder. Whenever you see that, that means the dragon. That's what they called it back then. It wasn't Dragon or Dragon Magazine. It was the dragon. Then you have this little cartoon here, which I think is by Tom Wong. I mean, this looks like his art style. So I don't think it's signed, but I'm pretty confident that that's who that is. And this is for the Dungeon Hobby Shop in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Okay, and then you have the sneak preview here, Introduction to Gamma World, excerpt from The Black Years by Hald Servin, 2562. Now, this is actually written by James Ward, and this is essentially the foreword or part of the introduction for the game Gamma World that's going to be published the next year. So this is coming out, at least 6 months early, if not before. I don't know what month. I don't remember what month in 1978 Gamma World is published, but they're already talking about it. So you're going to want to watch my videos on Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha to kind of understand the relationship between those and James Ward. So I'll put a link there. But that is what this particular article is. And it's interesting because it gives you absolutely zero context. It doesn't tell you that this is a new game coming out. Doesn't say anything. If they don't mention it in Tim Cass doesn't say like there's a new game coming out, check it out on this page. It's not even mentioned. So you're reading this, and it's just very interesting. Again, I think they were so close to this that sometimes I think they just couldn't understand that like people might not be aware of what they were talking about. But there you go. This is if you have Gamma World, this is pretty much word for word. I didn't check it exactly to see if they made any changes from this to when it finally gets published, but I've read this so many times, and this looks pretty much to me like what it says in the actual publication, and it's very evocative. I found very disturbing when I was a kid because it's talking about these shadowy organizations, these groups that one in particular that essentially is demanding that the world stop fighting, and they don't stop. And so they just nuke every capital city of every country in the world all at once. And it creates this, what they call the Black Years that, and then Gamma World, the game, the setting takes place like hundreds of years after that had happened. So you've had hundreds of years of this radiation buildup to mutate everything. And, the mutations in Gamma World, again, are very much like Metamorphosis Alpha. They're more comic book like as opposed to deadly. But this scared me a lot as a kid because, I grew up in the 80s. I was a Cold War kid. And this was, this seemed like something that was realistic, that it could really happen. So Then we see here coming in, it's again, very weird. Coming in the dragon number 9, and he says the conclusion of Finster Family, and it says a complete satirical fantasy minigame for any number of players, Snit Smashing. No, that's not going to come in 9. It's going to come in 10. So they were off. And then there's no mention of what's coming in issue number 10. And then it says coming in number 11. And it's not new D&D content. It's a short story by Fritz Leiber and a fantasy board game based on an adventure by Nudrick Deferred, famed adventurer. So, again, I think it's very interesting. With hindsight, we look back and think of Dragon as being the place where Dungeons and Dragons content debuts. And I talked about that in my introduction, and it is. But if you look here, there's nothing about D&D in any of this. They're focusing on short stories and separate games, like board games. All right, so that's that. And then we have some more ads here. The archive miniatures. And then an article by Robert J. Kuntz. Now, we haven't talked about him too much. He is one of the original guys that was there with Gary Gygax at the very beginning. So he was an initial player in Greyhawk, and he and Gary were friends. And the story, as I understand it, so Rob is younger than Gary is or was at the time. And, you know, Gary's unfortunately passed away, as you know, but my understanding is that at a certain point, Gary kind of allowed Rob to kind of stay with him and live with him because Rob didn't have a place to stay. And so that's, you know, a short version of the story. I don't know all the details, but I'm just remembering that as I'm talking about this. So they had a very close friendship and worked together a lot. But it's also funny because you see in later years, and I just talked about this very, very recently in another one of my videos, where in older age, they're sniping each other in the comments on the comments on an article about the contents of a particular thing, and Gary's saying, no, it didn't happen that way. And Rob's like saying, no, you're remembering it incorrectly. It happened this way. And Gary's like, no, you're full of BS. Like it was this and you have no idea what you're talking about. And it was just really funny because I know that they were friends. I know that they were close. And so just to kind of see them sniping at each other, just being grumpy old guys, it's just kind of funny. But it was an article that was written on the Kaium about the contents of you know, some of the early materials. But anyway, Rob was also co-designer with Gary on a lot of the original books that came out, like the supplements for Dungeons and Dragons. And here he's writing an article on gems and jewelry in D&D. Once again, probably a little overly detailed, which is fine if you like that. A lot of people like having this kind of stuff, and it has been brought to my attention. Like, you know, I did that video where I talked about the Dungeoneer Survival Guide and the Wilderness Survival Guide and how they had just an abundance of detail that was probably never going to come up and play. And somebody said, yeah, but if it does, you'd be glad that you'd read this because you'd know how to handle it. And I can see that point of view. I prefer to not have to try to memorize all that stuff or get another book out. But I do think it makes sense that, you know, if you have no idea how to handle a particular situation, such as how to use gems and jewels, it might be helpful to have at least read this and know, you know, that you could refer to it to kind of come up with something. So that's that particular article there. And then this is the one that I mentioned again in the introduction. So you want realism in D&D. So let's blow this up a little bit, make it easier to see. This is by Brian Bloom, who, as you recall, is one of the 3 founders of Tactical Studies Rules, and then also one of the 3 founders of TSR Hobbies, Inc. So he says, we at TSR have heard several people express a desire for a system which gives more realism and variety to the method for determining the natural abilities of player characters in D&D. And you're going to tell right away that this is a very tongue-in-cheek article. After minutes of exhaustive research, we've come up with the optional system, which is designed to replace the old method of rolling 3 dice for each of a player's abilities. This system is guaranteed to make a player character conform more to the abilities of the actual person owning them, and will provide a great variety in these abilities from person to person. And so then he says, strength, to determine your strength, you're going to go to the gym and military press as much weight as you possibly can, then divide the number of pounds you lifted by 10, and the result is your strength. And then he does similar things like matching intelligence to your IQ. Wisdom is calculating the average number of hours that you spend playing D&D or working on your D&D campaign in an average week. Subtract that number from 20, and that's your wisdom. And I find that very interesting because you see here, he says, I did I did this for myself. And he says his wisdom was 19. So based on his calculation, that means that he only spent an hour a week playing D&D or working on his D&D campaign. So unless he did his math wrong or something and he wasn't following his system, I kind of think like maybe it should have been 1. He spends 19 hours working on it or playing. But anyway, this implies that he only spends 1 hour playing D&D a week, which I think is interesting. Okay, and then dexterity is like, running a 440 and, figuring out. Constitution was the number of consecutive months you've gone without missing a day of school or work due to illness, and he put 9 for himself. And then charisma was the number of times you've appeared on TV or had your picture printed in the newspaper. Multiply this number by 2, and the result is your charisma rate. And then he put 14. So he's saying that he's been in the newspaper or on TV 7 times in his life at this point. And then, again, he's multiplying that by 2 to get 14. All right. So that is that particular article. It's just, again, within the context of the time, this was something that people were always talking about. Oh, rolling 3d6 isn't realistic. And, we want more realism. Combat's not realistic enough, like all these different things. So this is their way of saying, particularly it's Brian Bloom, he's writing the article, but a lot of the people at D&D, Gary Gygax included, thought that putting realism in D&D was sort of like a fool's errand. It's a game and it should be played as a game. And so this is their kind of way of saying, like, you want realism? Fine. Here's how you do it as a joke to see like what people would say. Okay, so let's keep moving along here. Over on the left, this is their review of different miniatures that have come out from the Fantasy Four. So it looks like an ad, but it's actually a review of the different miniatures. So they're talking here about some stuff by, it says the 5 beauties in the top group shot are by Garrison of England. And so it talks about there's a Hawkman, and then there's, some other things here by Grenadier. There's some EPT things and Dragon Tooth miniatures, stuff like that. All right. And then over here on the right, we have for the featured creature, this great drawing again by Errol Otis, who I think to date has done all of the featured creature illustrations. And so you have this really cool looking, I think it looks kind of cool. I don't know what it is. And they don't know either, which is why they're asking you to name that monster. And then they say in 2 notes or less, which is a reference to a popular television game show at the time called Name That Tune. And so basically says that if you want to, you can name it and identify it and give it specs, hit points, attacks, etc. No more than 350 words of history, characteristics, habits, special abilities, whatever. And then the winner gets at least $25 in cash and various certificates from TSR and Ralpartha. And then there's 5 additional prizes, becomes property, whatever. So the idea is it's a contest to name this monster. So if we want to see what that is, we're going to have to keep watching these video series in the future when they unveil who won. Okay, and then you just add down here on the right-hand side, we have seen this one before. This is for Troy, reliving the greatest epic battle of all by the Chaosian, which is how they referred to themselves during this period of time. Okay, and then we're going to look at an article here on still more additions to Metamorphosis Alpha. So we're now on issue 8. I think there's been a Metamorphosis Alpha article. I want to say in every issue so far. I don't think that's true, but it's been on a lot. And it was also in Strategic Review. So this was, they were putting a lot into this game. So all of the articles, except for I think 1 so far, have been by James Ward, who was the creator of Metamorphosis Alpha. So if we've seen before in one of Tim Kask's editorials, he says that if you see the creator of the game write an article, that means it's official. So that means this is official Metamorphosis Alpha content. So interestingly enough, and basically it's just more monsters. So mutated plants you see here listed, and then there's going to be some animals on the next page we'll get to in a second. Great Lakes Convention presented by the Western New York Wargamers Association, and then an ad here for Ralpartha, some more miniatures. So here's your monsters. James Ward really loves to call monsters in Metamorphosis Alpha and in Gamma World by something oid at the end. So you have your Tigeroid, and then here, so doesn't flow off the tongue, Mountain Gorillaoid, and then you have your Bolaroid, and then all these other creatures. And he kind of tells you like what they were based on originally, which is always kind of fun to see how they mutated into something else. And then you have an ad here for Gen Con South, which was going to be held in Jacksonville, Florida. And then the Balboa Game Company. So interestingly enough, we just talked about them in another video where I talked about the sort of the Caltech influence on Dungeons and Dragons, and talked about how the people at Caltech, like they had a connection with the folks at Balboa Game Company and the Warhouse, which was the game store that they owned, and how Balboa Game Company published the variant rules that the Caltech group was playing, first in Spartan issue number 9, and then later on as its own variant game called Warlock. And so now we're seeing an ad for them here. So this is the second big California game store that was being advertised in a national magazine in the same month. These guys were in Long Beach. And unfortunately, it is also now gone. And it made it really far. I think they didn't go out of business until like 2019. So they just couldn't hold on, which is too bad, because it was, I think if you think of like 3 classic, historic, like for their impact on the overall tabletop role-playing game community, 3 game stores in Southern California, it would have been The Last Grenadier, The Warhouse, and Aero Hobbies. And all 3 are now closed. And all 3 within like the past 10 years. So, Aero Hobbies might have been a little bit before that, but still, I mean, I went to Aero Hobbies in the early 2000s a couple of times, and they were still around. So it's just unfortunate that they are now gone. All right, now I'm going to blow this little cartoon up here, but this is by Tom Wong. Okay, this cartoon here called Floating in Timeless Space. And the reason I'm blowing this up to look at it is because this is going to be the basis, just, spoiler alert, I guess, for the game Snit's Revenge that we're going to talk about, that debuts or is published in issue number 10. So I'm not going to read this whole cartoon. You can, pause the video here if you really want to read it. I think it's a little hard to follow. I think Tom knew what he was doing, and maybe he got a little too up in his own head. And, I hate to say this, I like Tom Wong. He's a very funny guy. I love his art. I think he's a great creator. I don't think this is really that funny, but it's also like his first kind of debut in here. So, and it does spawn a game, and actually a sequel to that game, if I remember correctly. But Tom Wong is still around. He is, I think, in the Lake Geneva area, and he still goes to conventions where, like, if you sign up ahead of time, like, you can actually play role-playing games or his board games with him, like, when he's there. So one of my friends on Facebook, who is another old school role-playing game player from back in the day, he mentioned to me, he's like, next time you're around, like, let us know. We'll have you join a game with Tom, like at their house, which I was like, that was really cool. So I don't know when I'm going to get out there. I hope it's sooner rather than later, but you never know. So an ad here for the Articles of War game store in Buffalo, New York. Dungeon open every Friday. So I guess you were supposed to know what that was. I assume that just means it's where they had an open role-playing game thing. I did try to look that up, and it doesn't look like it's still around. However, it does seem like there is a pretty decent game store community of, more than just one store in Buffalo, which is pretty cool. All right, so then an ad here for Wizards and Warriors. We've seen this ad before over on the left-hand side. And then here's an ad for a new game by TSR Hobbies, classic Great Bell Lizard logo, for Suspicion. So essentially what this is, it's one of those like murder mysteries in a box games, very early on. So very kind of ahead of its time. And again, kind of like, straddling that line between war games and board games and role-playing games, kind of all mixed up, maybe a little bit less on the war game side, but that kind of intersection between like a traditional board game and then a role-playing game. And that's kind of where this is at. Also, clearly they're trying to get into like a new market here. They're trying to get beyond just like the hardcore war gamers and medieval fantasy kind of thing and get into something new. So this game doesn't stick around very long. TSR does dabble throughout most of its length of its history with this kind of idea of like these sort of party games that are very much, again, like the how to host a mystery type of thing. And if you've ever played one of, I mean, they're not bad. They're kind of fun. I've done it a few times at parties, and it's kind of a nice icebreaker, especially for people who don't like to play what I would call a regular role-playing game. All right, so then you see this back here where they're still advertising, or they're still letting you know that you can advertise on the back. I'm going to jump right into issue 9. So let's just keep going here. So here we have another great cover, a science fiction cover, and this is also by Bill Hannon, same one who just did the cover for issue number 8, and again, also Dragon number 1. So but venturing out of that kind of fantasy into this science fiction thing, this really cool looking, I think it's a cool looking gun. Like, I like stuff like this because it's just different from the standard everything else that you see. Like it's got this little tube coming out here, and it's got all these weird things happening here in the gun. Like the detail here is a lot different than what you just see on a standard kind of, what usually people accept as being like a standard, ray gun or whatever. So I think it was kind of cool. Now we have an ad over here on the left-hand side for the debut of the Dungeons and Dragons Sword and Sorcery role-playing game. Everything you need to begin playing D&D. So it says basic set. This is the Holmes basic set. It's hard to tell because this reproduction is terrible of the cover art by Dave Sutherland. But this is the Holmes basic set. So that's going to be the first kind of new edition of D&D published after the original. Now, at the time, they didn't really think it was a new edition. They thought they were cleaning up the original rules and writing them for beginners who didn't have a war game background to make it easier to understand and jump right in and playing. Because again, we've talked about this before, but if you had never played original Dungeons and Dragons with the people who created it, and if you didn't have a wargaming background, if you just grabbed that box and tried to read it and create your own game or play your own game, you would be so confused. That's one of the reasons why the folks at Caltech developed Warlock. It's one of the reasons why Steve Perrin created Tunnels and Trolls. It's because they had the game, they had the box set, which theoretically had the rules, and they couldn't make heads or tail of like how to actually play because they hadn't been taught by the people who did it. And that's always the best way to learn how to play. But those rules just weren't written for people really that didn't have a background in doing that kind of thing. Same ad over here again for the D&D figures. So let's just jump ahead and get into Tim Kask's editorial. Again, I'm going to blow this up a little bit just to make it easier to read. So almost the entirety of this editorial here, he's talking about having gone to Origins 77, and Origins was new at the time, and it was sort of like, for a while it became sort of the main competitor to Gen Con. But it was new at the time. And so he's kind of talking about like the pros and cons of having been, and that they're going to have another one, and the next one's not going to be run by the same people, I think, if I remember correctly. And so they would be able to take care of all the issues that happened. And that's basically the gist of what this is. And then he talks a little bit at the end here about how the next issue is going to go to 40 pages. Normally it's 32. They're going to go to 40 pages. And then they're going to put that Snit Smashing game into here. So I think I called it Snit's Revenge in the introduction. I just realized that is the sequel that I was just talking about. The original game was called Snit Smashing. And then, he talks about the Floating in Timeless Space. That's the cartoon that Tom Wham done that the game is based on. Now, I think probably the biggest thing to come out of this specific issue number 9, is the fact that the staff artist now is David Tramp. I'm going to say Trampier, and I really don't know. I've heard people say that, and I've also heard them say Trampier. Most people just call him Tramp. So moving forward, I'm going to say Tramp. And that's meant with respect. I love his art. He's the guy who did the artwork for the original first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook, the one with the big idol, the orange idol. And to me, that is quintessential D&D because it actually shows a party of adventurers adventuring. It doesn't show a lone single hero in a sweeping, environment like fighting a dragon or something like that. It shows a party of adventurers doing what D&D adventurers do, at least to me. So, but he debuts in here with a cartoon. Well, he's the staff artist, but he also debuts a very famous cartoon in Dragon Magazine that's going to run for several years called Wormy. And we're going to get to see the first issue of Wormy right here in this particular issue. Now you have this article over here called Varied Player Character and Non-Player Character Alignment in the Dungeons and Dragons Campaign by Gary Gygax. As you saw in issue number 8, Gary loves these very long titles. So the gist of this article, it's very interesting because it really gets to the heart of how some of the early players of Dungeons and Dragons, particularly, I think, the Lake Geneva group, but not exclusively, but it was very much player versus player. They were playing to win. And when there's no victory condition in a typical game where you have an endpoint, you say by this point, the person who's done XYZ is the winner. You don't have that in D&D. So the way that they won was by accumulating the most treasure, getting to be the highest level, and having the most stuff. Okay, so what's interesting in this article, it's basically the point of this article is that when new players join the game, they shouldn't be forced to play the alignment that the existing players want them to play just because the existing players are all playing the same alignment, which is, I just think, such an interesting thing to look at. And again, this is what I'm talking about with the history of reading these articles and understanding how it impacts the future of D&D. But at the time these guys were playing, where if you had a group of established players and they'd all decided that they were going to be chaotic and just run around breaking the law and killing stuff and looting and pillaging, and then some new player came in and wanted to play lawful, the way Gary talks about it, it appears that it was very common for the experienced players to say, no, you can't play that. We all have to be the same alignment, and we're chaotic, so you have to be chaotic too. And Gary gives tips to the players to basically explain to them that, to the new players, and say, you're under no obligation to tell other people what alignment you are. And in fact, it might be beneficial to not tell them. And here's ways that you can get around it so that they don't know what alignment you are. It's just such a different way of playing than I think most people play the game today. And I think it's really a fascinating look at the evolution of the game and alignment and how it's progressed and changed over time. And by progress, I don't mean to get better. If you like to play that way, there's nothing wrong with it. I just think it's interesting. I've never played in a game like that. I've never played where people were trying to pressure me into playing a specific alignment. And but it seems like it was pretty common with Gary's group based on this particular article here. And the article goes on. Now we have an ad for White Dwarf, the magazine of science fiction and fantasy games. This is sort of the UK's version of Dragon magazine. So this is their entry after they had just like Dragon had a precursor in the Strategic Review, the White Dwarf had a precursor magazine called Alan Weasel. And if you watch my video, please watch this one. It's one of my favorites. It's my video on the history of TSR UK and the Fiend Folio book. But I talk all about the very strong ties and connection between TSR and Games Workshop. And the way that connection came about was that the people at Games Workshop sent copies of Owl and Weasel over to Brian Bloom and the folks at TSR, and Brian called them up and, this is the short version, and basically said, hey, we really like this. How would you guys like to be the official D&D distributors in the UK? Because they already had like a system in place. And I thought that was really interesting. So, but anyway, watch that video. There's a link up here. But this is the debut of White Dwarf, which is, again, it's going to be really important in the history of role-playing games in general, but specifically in D&D until it becomes a house organ that essentially just publishes stuff. It's still around, but all they do now is talk about Warhammer 40K. It's you never see anything else in there. But for a time, very much like Dragon, it was focused on a variety of different things. You can see here they were covering Metamorphosis Alpha, D&D, but they had some more D&D stuff. But it says the magazine, science fiction, and fantasy games. So it was intended to cover more than just Dungeons and Dragons. All right, the continuation of this story here by Harry Fisher, that one about the family of modern magic, which goes on and on. Now, Tramp is credited as the staff artist in this issue, which I think the implication is that he did this art. It's just, to me, this doesn't look like his art, but it's not signed, so I'm not really sure. I'm not sure who did this piece of art here. Over here, we have an ad for Excalibur Games, their game Quasar, with this character that totally is not a duck wearing a Darth Vader helmet. I'm sure that's not what they meant it to be, but it's obviously very clearly based on Star Wars. This comes out in September of 77, so Star Wars would have come out in May of the same year, so a few months earlier. So this helmet is completely a ripoff of Darth Vader. But to me, that always looked like a duck. I don't know why. It's just... But anyway, this was their space game, a war game of science fiction conflicts set in the far future. Excalibur games still around after all these years. They publish a lot of different war games, a lot of World War II, military war games, things like that. But, a variety of different things. They have like a Sherlock Holmes card game as an example. So it's kind of cool that they are still around. So kudos to them. And the continuation of the story by Harry Fisher. Another ad for Archive Miniatures. Fantasy Forge, again, this is the sort of the review of the new miniatures that have come out. And you can see there were a bunch of them that came out during this time period. And, review is strong because basically they're just telling you who makes them and where to get them. So these ones down here are Archive. Grenadier here, number 5. This is Tom Lobach, General Artworks, McEwen Miniatures. And then Stan Johansson here. All right. So the continuation of the story, 2 ads here. We've seen these 2 ads multiple times before. All right. So the story ends here on page 20. And then here you have Seal of the Imperium by M.A.R. Barker. The short version of this is that this is sort of like the questions and answers or an FAQ about how to play Empire of the Petal Throne. And it's written by the game's creator, M.A.R. Barker. So if you remember Sage Advice from Dragon Magazine, this was essentially the Sage Advice for EPT. So it covers like how does magic work and different things on the different creatures and races and classes and things like that in Empire of the Petal Throne. We've seen this ad before by Wizards and Warriors. And then The Fastest Guns That Never Lived, Part 2. I really dig these articles. So this is written for Boot Hill, but it's basically taking fictional characters, Wild West characters from TV or movies, and then translating them into mechanics for the Boot Hill game so that you could use these and do like this would be PvP, player versus player, or it could be, player versus a non-player character, I guess played by the DM, but in that case, it's still player versus player. But using these in a game and figuring out like who was fastest, who had the best gun accuracy and throwing accuracy, bravery, strength, and experience. And then there's special abilities here that are listed off to the side. So just a fun article. You've got Don Red Berry, member for starring in the movie series The Adventures of Red Ryder. William Wild Bill Elliott, who starred in The Great Adventures of Wild Bill Hickok. And then he took over as Red Ryder after Red Berry left the series. Hoot Gibson was a very famous actor of early silent westerns and the first cowboy stuntman. William S. Hart, another early silent western movie actor, says he never made a talkie. So if you're a younger viewer, you might not know. So talkies are pictures, movie pictures, motion pictures that had, sound in them. The original ones didn't have those. And so they when they were starting to become a thing, when silent pictures started to fade away, they called them talkies. And it was kind of a derogatory term because a lot of people thought it wasn't real art because you didn't have to emote as much because people could hear you talking. So it's funny how we look at this kind of stuff. But Tom Holt, anyway, was in My Darling Clementine, along with Henry Fonda, Victor Mature, Walter Brennan, and Ward Bond. And then Alan Rocky Lane. I'm not going to read all these, I guess. But, a lot of really fun characters. Lee Van Cleef from, the A Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, like some of my favorite spaghetti westerns. Kind of, define the genre of spaghetti westerns, I think. And then Cisco Kid and Poncho. So you have that. Then you have this article here on Tombs and Crypts by James Ward. And basically what he's talking about here is how to create these as a referee. So again, really great advice for stocking, a crypt. And he talks about, figuring out how many, gems, maps, jewelry, magic items, etc. would be in a crypt. And then who might be there. Soldier, hero, priest, all kinds of things there. Evil High Priest, that's what EHP stands for. That was a very common acronym back at the time. They used it and just assumed, I think, that everybody would know what they were talking about. So we've got our ad here by Last Grenadier again, and then Dragon Tooth Miniatures by Tom Loback that we saw covered in the Fantasy Forge earlier. Now we have an ad over here on the left-hand page by, again, the Chaosium for the Elric of Melniboné game, Michael Moorcock's creation. So this game came out, or was going to come out, around September of 1977. It's part of what was responsible partially for the little kerfuffle that happened when James Ward put the Melnibonéan mythos into the first printing of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Deities and Demigods book. And, I've talked about this before, but a lot of people spread a lot of misinformation about this and say that James screwed up, and he did not. He's mentioned several times before he passed away. He was interviewed saying that he actually wrote to Michael Moorcock and got his permission to use those mythos, or whatever you want to say, the creatures, the concepts in Deities and Demigods, because it was a book. And there was a lot of confusion, I think, at the time over these advanced D&D hardbacks, because it was a game, but they were being published as hardback books. And, I'm not exactly telling the story in detail, but Chaosium, or again, the Chaosium, had the rights to publish games based on that world. But James wasn't publishing a game. He was just using the gods and the characters in a chapter of a book for another game. Anyway, Michael Moorcock gave his permission, but the Chaosium said, no, we have the rights because and rightly so. I mean, they paid for them, so they had no business to not say that it couldn't be done. But it's not that James Ward just blindly went into this and, didn't ask for permission. He did. And so again, I like to always mention that, because the story I grew up hearing was that TSR screwed up and didn't realize that other people had the rights to it. Or like they did with Tolkien and the Barsoom stuff, they just went full speed ahead and didn't care and didn't realize that they needed to ask permission, or were hoping that nobody would notice, or whatever the case would be. But in this case, I think by the time this came out, they had learned their lesson. But anyway, you see the ad here for the game, and also for All the World's Monsters, which is like a monster book, including random monster creation table, also by Chaosium. Then you see again here, full page cartoon by Tom Wham, Floating in Timeless Space. So I think this was intended to be like an ongoing thing. But it mentions at the end, again, I'm just going to make it a little bigger so we can see it easier. But, whoops. On the very last panel, he talks about, in Dragon 10, Snit Smashing, a game. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the next issue partially. Okay, so that's that. Now, here's the debut of Wormy. So, again, I've mentioned how much I like Tramp's art. If you just look at this art here, and I'm not downplaying anybody else's art, but if you look at some of the other stuff that's in here, I mean, there's not a ton of art in this issue, but then you look at Wormy, just the perspective, the character design. Obviously, it's full color, which is a big deal. But even without the color, I think it just the designs are just so eye-catching. And this was a very fun, long, ongoing cartoon in Dragon that I really enjoyed. I liked Phineas Fingers too for different reasons, but I really liked Wormy. So this is the first debut of Wormy, and then you have Phineas Fingers is back. Remember, Tim Kask was saying he doesn't know when it's going to come back because he couldn't get a hold of the creator. Well, he's back, and here's the next installment of that. And again, just some more ads here. So Lyle's Hobby and Craft Center, I looked that up. That seems to be long gone. An ad here for the Dungeon Hobby Shop. Breastplate. And then Florida's largest Modelers Mart. And then Articles of War. So most of these places are all gone now. Which is too bad. All right, we've seen these two ads before, Ral Partha and then Star Empires. I just talked about them, and then the back cover. All right, so let's continue on and jump into issue number 10. Now, new cover artist this time. This is by John Sullivan. So we have briefly talked about John Sullivan before. because he created a creature, the featured creature in Dragon Magazine number 6 called the Death Angel, and he provided the art for it. And if you remember that and you see the art, it's very obvious that he did this art as well. He has a very distinctive style. So I quite like this cover. I think it's pretty cool. I really like the shining bits on the armor. It's like a nice touch. Okay, so we're going to dive in here with these ads. We've talked about the ones on the right before. So on the left, we see an ad for Winter Fantasy 2, going to be happening in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin at the the American Legion Hall, and a non-commercial gaming get-together. So they say non-commercial because it was run by TSR Hobbies. And then it says, we're going to have D&D, Metamorphosis Alpha, and Empire of the Petal Throne games all set, a Mahjong tourney too, but we need your help. Contact Mary Gygax, Gary Gygax's wife, right away if you would enjoy judging a game or tournament. Thanks. All right. So then we get into Tim Kask's editorial here. And again, just making a little bigger, easier read. This one talks a little bit about Gen Con 10 being over and, they're recuperating and everything like that. So that's part of it. Then he says this issue contains 36 pages, which is up 4 from the old size. Remember, he said it was going to be 40, but it's 36. And then the extra 4 pages were used for the Snits board. And we'll talk about that when we get to talking about that game. And then he says this issue is different from those preceding it. In a couple of respects. So he says, look at the table of contents and you'll see a new sense and system of organization evidenced by the new listings. Like always the flowery language with these folks, but it is much easier to read this, see what's going on and how to navigate through this issue, which is pretty important. And, they're again, it's really fun to read these and kind of see them coming into their own and figuring things out as they go along. He talks about using second-class mail. Snit Smashing should not mislead anyone. That does not mean that the Dragon's going to become a board game magazine, nor does it mean that we're going to publish games on a regular basis. They do publish a few board games during the history of the magazine. Eventually, they're going to start focusing more on adventures for role-playing games, usually Dungeons & Dragons, and specifically advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They do a few of the standard D&D adventures. They also have at least one for Gamma World, one for Top Secret, and it's at least one of each of those. But the majority over time is going to be advanced D&D adventures. But they do still publish from time to time board games. And that will be coming along in the future. So we see our table of contents here, but we also see the staff artists have grown. So now we've got all 3 of the people that we've seen listed here before. Dave Sutherland, Tom Wam, and Dave Tramp. And then again, the cover by John Sullivan. All right, and then it just dives right into this very interesting article with a very deliberately, I think, provocative title, which is Too Much Loot in Your Campaign? D&D Option, Orgies Incorporated. So they're going to, over time, stop doing stuff like that, but this is early on. But the gist of this article is that if you've given away, as a referee, if you've given away too much treasure to your players and it's getting out of control where like they're just swimming in money and you don't know what to do, you can figure out a way to take some of that away. And one of the things that the article talks about, this is by John Pickens. We've talked about him before, very early game designer at TSR, and he lasts for decades as a game designer into, I think it was at least into the WotC era. I seem to recall he worked on 3rd edition. But he basically says something that has become sort of I don't want to say a mantra, but it's become a defining characteristics of a lot of old school games that are like retro clones or games that seek to emulate the old school way that D&D was played back in the day. And he says, instead of receiving experience for gaming treasure, players would receive experience only as the treasure is spent. And so, again, for those of you who are new to D&D, or at least new to looking at older D&D and the original versions of the game, you gained experience almost exclusively by gaining treasure. 1 gold piece equaled 1 experience points. And so a lot of times you would go after the biggest creatures that had the most treasure, even though you were lower level, because you weren't intending to fight them. The idea was you'd stake them out, you'd find the dragon and where his hoard was, and then you do the classic, like, wait till it was asleep or wait till it left, whatever the thing is. Maybe you create a diversion and you get the dragon moving, and then you run in and you scoop up the treasure and you get out as fast as you can, and you hope that the dragon never finds you. And then you calculated all those gold pieces, and that's how you gained your experience points. So you were much better off gaining your XP, not fighting, because fighting puts you at risk. You could die. And you didn't get that much experience points from combat. The only experience points that would come from not the only, you got a very minimal amount for fighting, but you got most, if you killed the thing, then you could come back and take its treasure. So this article is basically saying the way to avoid that happening is that you don't get the XP for that treasure that you've accumulated until you spend it. And then it gives you all these ideas for how to spend it. So philanthropy and spending it on magic research and clan hordes and orgies, and then gambling, all that kind of stuff. I think the gist of the article is very cool, and it gives a perspective into old school play, which is this idea that, I know Tolkien was an influence in the game, but when you read stuff like that, it's very clear that the sword and sorcery heroes like Conan and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser that are out there boozing and gambling and womanizing and doing all that thing with their money, those were sort of like the inspirational heroes that they thought they were emulating when they were playing the game, or like at least some of them did. And so then it becomes clear, then it makes sense. They wanted to get the money so that they could spend it on stuff and like blow it like in a big party almost, essentially. And that's what this article is talking about, is how to remember that and then how to create it in your game from a mechanical standpoint so that the characters have to do that to go up in levels. So I think it's an interesting article. There's the stuff with like orgies and stuff is not something I would ever put in a game. I mean, obviously I run a game for my daughter and her friends. That's not something that's going to be in there. But this idea I do have in the game, I have things where they spend money to gain experience, but also these activities like gambling or, philanthropy or the magical research. I've incorporated that in the game as a way for them to like relieve stress that they've gained from losing composure, which is sort of like my, Cthulhu insanity mechanic. I don't call it insanity. I call it composure loss. And they lose composure when they encounter things that, mortals were not meant to see or encounter. And they lose composure points. And then at a certain point that will give them some kind of detriment. And the way that they can remove that detriment is by doing these things. So magic users do research, priests go to temple and pray, and fighters and rogues go out and party and eat food and gamble and do that kind of thing. And that's how they relieve their stress. That then gives them those composure points back. So I've adapted this idea, and it kind of came from this article, which was influencing a lot of old school game designers. Okay. Then there's this really fun article in here. Well, first off, there's a Gen Con final report, talks about the games that won, and very specifically it says that Dragon Magazine won Best Professional Gaming Magazine. And then they say paid for by Gen Con 10. I think that that's in there to let you know that Dragon didn't take up space in their own magazine to tell you that they won an award. Tim Kask was very kind of he was a little cagey on this when he was talking about how they were even being nominated. He didn't want to mention it because he felt like it was a conflict of interest. He doesn't say that, but if you read between the lines, it seems like that's what he was saying when he was talking about voting in Gen Con 10. But then it turns out they won an award here. So this article here on designing for unique wilderness encounters is fantastic. Daniel Clifton, who, as far as I can tell, I think this is the only role-playing game thing that he did in his career, but it's a good one, and it gets repeated in Best of Dragon Volume 1, which is where I kind of talked about this before. But again, this is a very non-mechanically oriented article telling you how to create really fun wilderness encounters. So this is the reason I mentioned this in the intro. I was trying to think of things that will like grab people's attention, and this is an article that people, if doesn't matter if you're playing Pathfinder or 5th edition or 13th Age or Shadow Dark or Old School Essentials or first edition, whatever, you're playing one of those games, a fantasy adventure game, this article would be very useful for giving you ideas on creating very unique wilderness encounters. So then this article here on random monsters, this is by Paul Montgomery Crabaugh. And he did a few articles, not a ton, but he did a few articles in different gaming magazines, including Dragon, but some other ones as well. But this, again, a fun article here, but it's for creating random monsters. And he talks about the problem. Now listen to this problem. If you're a D&D referee, dungeon master, again, even if you're 5e, you've encountered this problem. It says, one of the problems with D&D is that the player characters always know too much. This is news. It says, you obtain surprise over 3 clicks. And the players are like, clicks? Oh, yeah, they're in supplement 3. Hand it over. Where's the Greyhawk? It had a note about them. And then they pause and then they say, we shout out November. And then the referee says, that's right. The clicks fall over dead. And 100%. I had this problem when I was running 3rd edition. I had one player in particular, and very smart player. And he was also a DM in a game that I played in. And so he knew the monsters backwards and forwards. He had one of those, like, it's not quite an eidetic memory, but it was really close. Like, he was really good at remembering things that were important to him. Like, so whether it doesn't matter, like, he has certain things that he just knows, and that stuff is like a moment recall away. And so he would know all these monsters. And he's also really good at doing math on the fly. So I would have encounters where I was changing the monsters because they weren't working. They weren't challenging enough. And he was saying, well, that has to be a higher challenge rating than we should really be facing because it's taken X number of damage. And you said it was this thing, but that thing doesn't have that many hit points, like that kind of thing. And it used to really bug me. He was using his skills that he knew. And, some people would call that metagaming and, whatever. But this article is how to avoid that problem by randomizing your monsters and giving them different abilities that the players won't be able to predict because they're not published in any book. That's the gist of the article. It's a good one. It's fun. I like it quite a bit. Things like, little things like this, special characteristics too. So you might have mammals that are hostile to dwarves or elves or hobbits. So they're still using hobbits here, even though this is October of 77. They should have stopped using that by now, but they're still saying that. Magic users, clerics or paladins being hostile to them, which is just kind of like a fun little tweak on a monster that you might not expect. And he's got reptiles and undead, like maybe missiles are ineffective or only magic weapons are effective, or they're destroyed by running water or cold, or turned by a mirror, turned by Wolfsbane, turned by God. So all these little things that you just might not expect to come up. Okay. So a fun, neat little article. So you've got here again, this little cartoon ad for, I think this is, well, I thought it was Dungeon Hobby Shop, but I'm not seeing a name on here. Could just be too small and I'm not making it out. Here is an ad for Judges Guild. So they've gone back to a single column ad, but still that's pretty big real estate in a magazine this size. And then this very fun article, Let There Be a Method to Your Madness. Now this is by Richard Gilbert. And again, this is the only article that I could find by him. And once again, this was picked up and published in Best of Dragon Volume 1. So I think it's just really interesting. There are so many articles in this particular issue that are being picked up and published in there. And it's because they were good, because these were designer, it even says design form. This is helping DMs become better at their game. And the idea here is that when you're designing your dungeon, you want to think about the person that created it and what culture they came from and how would that impact how they built their dungeon. He's basically telling you, don't just do it randomly and throw a bunch of runes together that don't make sense. And, back then that's what people did. And then people quickly started to figure out, like, some of the early published adventures really seemed like that. They seemed very cobbled together. Like, why would this group of creatures be living in a dungeon with this group of creatures? Like, how would that have happened? Because why haven't they tried to kill each other yet? And so this is an early example of trying to not do that and tell you how to make a more consistent and rational dungeon when you're designing it. An ad here for Cosmic Encounters. So this is when this game debuts 1977, and still a big hit in the board game community. I went to a convention once and played this with some friends, and I do remember it took quite a bit of time to explain. I'd never played it before, and then set up. And then it can take like over 2 hours to play. It's a pretty intense game, but fun. And it's fun to see that it is still, it's not published anymore by these guys. I think this is Eon Publishing or something like that. But the last version I think was Mayfair Games. And that was like in the early 2000s, which is around when I played it. I think right after that version had come out. It was down here at Strategicon in Los Angeles. Okay, so Snit Smashing. What is this? So this is a board game that is based on that cartoon that Tom Wom's been doing for the past few issues. So the gist of it, it's a 2-player game. You can play with more, but it's designed as a 2-player game where you've got these little snits, which are the tiny little creatures that you see in the cartoon, and they're running across this board, across this map, and they're trying to reproduce. And then there's this giant Bolotamus, which is trying to smash them. It's a very simple game. But the Snits are trying to get to 18. They're trying to reproduce up to 18. And the Bolotamus wins if he eliminates all of the Snits. So you take turns. You secretly plan your moves for your Snits and for the Bolotamus. And then the Snits move across the map. They're trying to reach this the Snandergrab, which is the breeding ground, or the sea, which is safety. And the Bolotamus can smash your Snits in its path. Or it can move the Snandergrab to hinder them from reaching it where they can reproduce. And the Snits that reach the Snandergrab reproduce and they lose life force. But the Snits that reach the sea are safe, but they lose life force. And then they have to return to the Snandergrab. And then the game continues until victory is achieved. And then there's, a multiplayer version where all the rules are similar, but all the players start with their Snits in the sea, and then you establish a turn order for the Bolotamus and the actions that it's going to take smashing or moving the Snandergrab, and the Snits follow the other players. It's just a really fun kind of goofy game, but it sort of created a little mini sort of like, I don't want to say phenomenon, that's too strong a word, but it became really popular because it was a fun game with this fun, goofy art. And it spawned a sequel. And then Tom Wom published like a combined game of Snit Smashing and Snit's Revenge in also, I think, in 2003, coincidentally enough. But where he combined them both into one kind of like with errata and stuff like that. So, not a strategic game really too much by any sense, more of like a fun little party game and a diversion from playing like a serious game of D&D. But this is a very popular game with folks that when this came out. Now, I never saw it. I never had seen this because, again, I didn't start reading Dragon until issue number 76. And I went back and got a bunch of issues back into the 60s, but nothing like this early, like issue 10. So I was aware of the game having come out because I think they talked about it from time to time in Dragon, but I'd never seen it until I got my CD-ROM for the Dragon Magazine CD-ROM, which is what I'm reading from right now. So that's Snit Smashing. Now you have this article here. So again, very much a product of its time, but it's talking about, again, sort of this realism aspect, but very much talking about, it says weights and measures physical appearance and why males are stronger than females in D&D. And so this is another article by Paul Montgomery Krauss, same guy, that we just talked about a second ago. And he has a kind of a fun little, tongue-in-cheek intro here where he says, nothing too ambitious. In one article, I hope to provide a new way of handling encumbrance, a way of describing the physical appearance of your characters, and hopefully provide an equitable and reasonable method of handling sexual differentiation. Should space allow it, I will also give you working blueprints for a warp drive and a one-page synopsis of the mind of God. Oh, well. So one of the things I really think is interesting about this article is that he says right here in the second paragraph, I'll start off by saying that I borrowed some of this from the Warlock rules printed in the Spartan number 9. So we just talked about that. That's in my video where I talk about the Caltech influence on D&D. So it's interesting that this is coming up again. It's just completely coincidental. When I made that video, I didn't know I was going to be making this one. I'm never quite sure when things are going to be coming up. But he says specifically the idea of the size characteristic. And so the gist of this article is that he's saying that you should have a 7th ability score, which is like your size, and that you should roll that, and that your size and your build will affect your character's height, their weight, and their carrying capacity. And that your racial adjustments, like if you're a dwarf, or once again, we're using the term hobbit here instead of halfling. If you're a dwarf or hobbit, you can carry more weight than humans and elves can carry because they have stockier builds. It's just the way that they're built. And then he says that female characters should get a bonus to constitution and dexterity, but they can actually carry less weight than males. So he doesn't talk about them having a strength penalty. He just says they don't carry as much, but they get bonuses to constitution and dexterity. And then he goes on to explain that, like, having them roll, which is what, if you remember a few issues ago, there was a very, at the time, controversial article. It was by Len Lakofka, and it talked about how, you can have a female character just the same as you could have male. Like, women are allowed to play D&D, but then he makes them roll all of their abilities different, gives them a beauty score instead of like a straight charisma score. And then he says to roll strength, they should roll a D8 and a D6. And Paul here is saying, no, they shouldn't do that. And then he goes on to cite research from biology and then also he says society rules, and basically says like women, female characters should have minimal physical ability differences from men based on, again, these he says real world biology. And he goes on to explain it. I'm not going to get into it. Either you agree with that or you don't, or also you think it's a game and it shouldn't matter, or you think that realism should insert itself in specific instances, but not in others. Play the game how you want. So I don't get into this. I just think it's too much to keep track of. Just, characters just roll the same for male and female. And to me in my games, there's no difference. I don't tell my daughter that her character can't be as strong as the dad player's character who plays, because it has no impact on me as a DM running my game, and it changes nothing about how the game is played. So why would I bother with that? But that's just me. I know a lot of people are very passionate about this. And in that video that I made, I got a few people that jumped in and made it very clear that in their games, they would make sure that the female characters have penalties because they aren't as capable as male characters. But anyway, that's them. So he then goes on in this article and talks about how he talks about physical appearance, but what he's really talking about is figuring out things like eye color, skin color, hair length, that kind of thing. So it's not like a beauty score. It's basically just helping to describe your character, which it's kind of, I guess it's fine. Sadly, this article is cut off. You see here on the side, and this is how it came in the CD-ROM that I got in my Dragon Magazine CD-ROM compilation. So I don't know if the original article was cut off like that, because I've never seen it like the physical copy. But it does make it a little bit hard to read this because the text here is getting kind of cut off. So this article's fine. Again, it's detail that I just don't need. It doesn't really come up to me that often that I need to know the height of a hobbit of size 7 versus size 14. That's fine if that's something you need. It just, for me, it's not something that comes up all that often. So There you go. All right. This one talks about gaining a new experience level. And it's a pretty long article, but the gist of it is that the author here is Tom Holsinger. And, I should have looked him up. I apologize for that, but I didn't look up his D&D kind of career. If there's anything exciting, I will put it like a little note here on the top as far as like anything else that he worked on. But he basically says that the rules are vague on how characters gain new abilities when they level up, like, and how they gain new hit points. Like, does it happen automatically? Like, it doesn't really say that. And so he gives a solution to talk about like, oh, you should undergo a ritual. You can have a ritual to attract the attention of the gods, and that attention that you attract, that you do that by praying at a temple or sacrificing evil creatures, that the gods will notice you, and then they will then give you these abilities. And then it talks about rituals where you have to become very drunk to enter a vulnerable state where the gods can grant you a new ability. And then it says this can be dangerous, especially at lower levels. It's fun, like world building stuff. Again, it's nothing specific that I would use, but I do like to have a little bit of like celebration when characters gain level. And because in my daughter's game, they don't gain levels very often. So I think I have mentioned this before, but we started playing, we played our first session in October of 2020. We'd been talking about it for a few months before that and created our characters and stuff, but our first actual session was October of 2020. So, it's been, because of school and finals and summer travel and stuff, we haven't played since May. But so our last game was May of 2024. So what is that? 3.5 years, roughly. And the highest level characters are the cleric and the thief are level 3. And my daughter's elf and her friend's elf are level 2. And that's because elves take the most experience points to gain levels. So when they moved from first to second level, it was a big deal. And I, watch my video series on, it's called DM Advice, but that's where I talk about the campaign that I run for my daughter. And then I provide examples of advice in the context of the game that I run for them, but you'll kind of get a sense of how I do that. So anyway, that's this particular article on gaining levels. And then there's this whole article on the tactics of diplomacy in the game Stellar Conquest. Edward Cooper, and again, apologies for not having looked this up ahead of time. I try to do that. I think I ran out of time this time. Was more focused on some of the other articles. But this is for the game, Stellar Conquest, which is more of like a board game. It's a strategy board game. It's not a role-playing game. But it talks about how you can use diplomacy, which technically you shouldn't be able to use because in that particular game, characters aren't really allowed to talk. I shouldn't say the players aren't allowed to talk. It's like the players' characters that they're controlling, they're not allowed to interact, right? So they can't communicate. So it's like, how do you use diplomacy? Because verbal communication is sort of banned within the game. But then it talks about different techniques that you can use to like maybe moving the board, the way that you move your piece on the board, you're communicating through that to the other player. And doing that over time can kind of communicate your intention to the other players without actually telling them what it is that you're doing. So that's sort of the gist of this article. I've never played Stellar Conquest, but it's still kind of an interesting way. It's like why I like articles like this, because it's showing the mindset of people who play these kinds of games and how they're always looking for a way to, I don't want to say break the rules, but like bend the rules and be creative to do a thing within the confines of the game. And what makes this so creative is because it's going to sound weird to say this because it's obvious, but like if they allowed you to talk in the game, then somebody wouldn't have come up with a system. But that's my point, is that having that limitation where you can't communicate to the other players and tell them what it is that you're doing, having that limitation forces you to be creative. Just like having limitations in a role-playing game force you to be more creative than letting you do anything that you want. I've mentioned that before. And again, I'm very much a proponent of like, if you are one of the kitchen sink type people who love all of the options, then that's how you should play if your whole group likes that. I like having fewer options like that, because I like seeing what my players do when they have a confine to work within and have to come up with a way around that because they weren't allowed to do all of the things. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, an ad here for Detroit WinterCon 6, and then an ad here for the Council of the Five Nations second annual Wargaming Convention, which is featuring TSR's E. Gary Gygax and fantasy games. And at this says at the studio of Bridge and Games. So it's going to be in Schenectady, New York. And it says in New York State's Capital District. So anyway, another convention, October of 1977. And then this really interesting article here, and I'll be quite honest, I'm not 100% sure if this is supposed to be real or like what it is, but it says final exam. There's no author. There's no context. Just says final exam, Wargame Design 202. Sort of like it's a university class. So this is an upper level class, 202 instead of 102. Read each question carefully and then answer each question in order. This test covers all of the elements necessary for a complete understanding of the principles of wargame design. Time limit is 3 hours. Begin now. So I think that the point of this article is trying to explain that like designing war games is very difficult and it requires a very large knowledge of a lot of historical events in order to make your game, good and help it to convey the historical era that it's trying to through its rules and mechanics, which is a lot harder than it might seem. So, but then these questions are just so goofy. It says, so history. Trace the history of Egypt from its beginnings to through the Arab-Israeli wars. Concentrate on, but do not limit your discussion to, its military, economic, social, political, and religious impact on the Near East, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Be specific and concise. So, see, just that one, that's when I read it and I was like, oh, I see. Like, I don't know that this is a joke, but it has to be. It has to be. Communication. In 15 minutes, 500 crazed Ugandans led by Idi Amin will charge into this classroom. Calm them. Like, explain how you would calm them. Psychology. Based on your knowledge of their careers and works, evaluate the emotional stability, repressed aggressions, and emotional adjustment of Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Adolf Hitler, and Genghis Khan. Support your own evaluation with quotations from their works using appropriate references. Translation is not necessary. I'm not going to read the rest of this, but I think you get the idea. It was kind of fun to read, but again, it almost just seems like filler. Like it's just this little box thing here. I have to suppose this was probably written by Tim Kask as a filler piece because they didn't have anything else to put there. Fantasy Forge. So again, we're talking about miniatures here. Some more stuff by Grenadier, Archive, Ralpartha, Minifigs. Diplomacy World. This little ad's back. This has been running on and off since the beginning of the magazine. So fun to see that back. Our second entry in the Wormy cartoon. So, and again, it's partly the color, I guess, but it just really stands out. It like pops, and plus the writing is really fun. I love his little hat here, and you never see his eyes. It's always over his eyes. He's a cigar smoking, dragon that seems like he's probably from Jersey or, New York, just the accents that they have and the way that they talk. So, yeah, we're going to obviously see more of Wormy as we go through this. So I think, if I remember correctly, at some point, the all of Wormy got collected, maybe, where you can read them all. I never picked that up, but I think that happened. Unfortunately, Tramp died, it's a very sad story. So he left TSR and Dragon. He kind of felt underappreciated, and there were reasons why that happened. He didn't get to keep his original art. It belonged to them. A lot of the art, not just from him, but from a lot of the artists, got thrown out when Wizards acquired TSR. And at a certain point in time, TSR had like a storage locker. And my understanding is they kind of couldn't pay for it because of everything that was happening. And they ended up just throwing tons of stuff out that was in the storage, including a lot of original artwork, because they didn't have anywhere to store it. And it didn't go back to the artist. A lot of it just ended up in a landfill. It's heartbreaking. But anyway, Tramp leaves, and not only does he leave the world of like TSR and gaming, he kind of leaves art. And he was out of the art world for a while. And then the story is that somebody hailed a cab. I forget what city they were in, and he was their cab driver. And the person recognized him and realized who he was and snapped a picture. There's a famous picture of him standing by his cab. And that kind of gave Tramp like sort of a second view on life of like, people know who I am. They liked my art. They want to see that. And he was kind of on the pathway to like, I think trying to like get some of his old art back or publish some new stuff and do some things with it. And then he passed away, and very young. And it's, another unfortunate story of one of the original, very early creators of Dungeons and Dragons, passing away far, far, far too young. So that's Tramp. So more ads here for Ralpartha, and then the Legions of the Petal Throne, which are the miniatures for Empire of the Petal Throne game. And then our back cover here. And again, we're pushing Little Wars, so they're sticking with it and talking about, we've read this ad before, so I won't get into it, but it's basically asking if you know all these like important events from history, and if you don't, then you should check out Little Wars. And then here's the board for Snit's Revenge. So this is part of it here, or Snit's Snatch. Snit Smash. I keep saying Snit's Revenge because that was the sequel game, but this is the board. And so again, you see all the colorful counters and the fun, goofy artwork. So it's no wonder people really like this game. Snit Smashing is the name of the game. So that was the board. And again, if this is one of those ones where like, if you still had this magazine as a physical copy and you had this board with all the counters and everything, it's worth quite a bit, because it's one of the ones that like old timers want. And most times when you come across this magazine as a physical copy on the secondary market, it doesn't have the game and the counters. So, like at least the board, it might have the rules on the inside, but, so that's it. That's our look at these 3 issues of Dragon Magazine. So I hope you enjoyed this, and please let me know. Let me know how you like this. Did I go too fast? Did I not go fast enough? I'm trying to be very cognizant. Somebody in the comments recently said that I repeat myself too much when I'm going through these. And so I'm trying to be aware of that. As you know, I don't have notes, and I'm going to be quite blunt. One of the reasons I don't have a script or I have notes, there's 2. One is because I do want it to sound a little bit more conversational. I want it to seem like we're having a chat, because people told me that they enjoy that. They like listening to that, and they feel that it's a little bit more conversational. And so that's a deliberate choice. The second choice is that my printer's been broken for the entire time I've had this YouTube channel. So I don't have scripts that I could print out, and I've just been lazy and not gone and bought a new printer. I know they're not that expensive, but it seems like an expense that I don't need, because the only thing that I'd be using it for right now is printing out the scripts for this. And so far, I feel like I haven't needed it. However, if you'd prefer that I had a strict, script that I follow and it's less conversational, let me know. But, again, that said, I am aware that I'm trying to not repeat things as much as I used to. So I hope that came through in this particular video, and that you noticed it. And if you did, let me know. Or even if you thought I was still repeating, let me know that too, because all those comments help me get better. That's what I'm trying to do, is just make this more fun for you guys to all listen to. So that all being said, thanks so much for sticking through this part of the video. And while you're leaving a comment below, again, you'll find places where you can find me on social media, and you can visit my blog where I'm posting content, and I'll be posting some more stuff there soon. I just did a post on my little graphic on the editions of D&D. Wes over at DM Tales said I should do a blog post about that, and so I did that. So I hope you enjoyed that one. And also, I'd like to thank again my super fans. It just means a lot that you guys comment on and contribute to my videos. And if you would like to let me know that you especially liked a particular video, there's a super fan button there and you can contribute whatever you're able to. And all of that, it helps tons. So I do save all that money up. I put it in a separate account. And, that's something that, like, as an example, I could use to buy a printer. I also need to get a new phone to record my videos. And that's a bigger expense. But I'm using a really old phone here that I can only hold about 20 to 25 minutes of recording time at a time because my phone is just so full and I've deleted as much as I can. So that's why I constantly have breaks during these videos, because I'm having to download the stuff off my phone and then start recording again. So just to give you an example of what stuff like that goes for, it's not for me to go out and buy beer and pizza. That's not what it's for. So thanks for all that. And thanks for sticking all the way through the video. I appreciate your support. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now and say thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made this video. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a cheat on this one because I wasn't actually drinking this when I did my notes for this video. I was having a little bit of wine that my wife and I had with dinner last night. But I wanted to show this because it's a extremely polarizing liqueur. And we'll just get into it. So this is MALÖRT. And so Jeppson is the last name of the person that created this. So MALÖRT is he's Swedish. And so it was invented in the Chicago area in the United States around the 1920s, I think. But MALÖRT translates in Swedish, as I understand, as moth herb, which is their way of describing wormwood. And a lot of alcoholic liqueurs and medicines were made with wormwood and or absinthe, and a lot of those back in the day were sort of at one point became illegal to have because they thought wormwood was this horrible thing that was going to do bad things to you. And it turns out it's just that people were drinking too much. It had nothing to do with the fact that it was wormwood, but people used to think it caused hallucinations and things like this. So So this liqueur is made with a base of wormwood. So it's in this janky plastic bottle, oddly enough. So it's very hard to come by outside of Chicago. There in Chicago, it's pretty famous among bartenders and apparently also biker gangs, I guess. But it's part of a Boilermaker, which is a beer and alcohol shot. And the one in Chicago is called a Chicago Handshake. And this is the spirit that they use. And then they mix it with like an old style beer. So I got this at my local bar that I go to. I go once a week with my friends for lunch and, just chat about whatever business and work. And these are people that I work with as well as am friends with. So it's sort of like our business meeting because I don't have an office outside of my home. And the rep for MALÖRT, he reps a bunch of other things, but he happened to be in there. And we were talking about this because I had this before, but most people hadn't. And he happened to have this half full janky bottle that he uses for tastings and stuff. And so he pulled it out of his bag and then he just let me keep it. And I've had this for about 2 years now and I have not had it since I brought it home. So I'm going to share this with you guys here. So it's a liqueur in the style of like an Amari, an Italian Amaro. But very, different. So this one's made with wormwood again, and anise or anise, however you want to say that, which I know a lot of people don't like. That's that kind of licorice flavor. I don't think this tastes like that. So I've seen it described as tasting like a grapefruit that was soaked in gasoline, or there's a lot of very flowery language that people use to describe this, like fermented Jolly Rancher. I've heard it described as drinking shame and regret. There's a whole bunch of ways of describing this. It is extremely aggressive. I don't think it really plays well in cocktails at all. This is one of the few spirits I have that I have not used in a cocktail. Anyway, I'm going to have a little sip here. Oh, that is a powerful nose. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd forgotten the flavor of that. So I first tasted this actually at, of all places, my local comic book shop. One of the managers there, she used to live in Chicago, and she loves this stuff. And so, she knew I was into cocktails, and so she was talking about it. And I mentioned I'd never had it, and so she brought it into the shop and let me have like a little taste. And it is a thing. So not going to recommend that you go out and buy it, because quite honestly, you'll probably never drink it again and you will have wasted money on a bottle. I think the best way that you might get a little sense of what it's like, although it is very tongue-in-cheek, there's a very fun Instagram account called Unemployed Wine Guy. He's a sommelier, but I'm guessing this is real. I think he got like kind of let go from his job or whatever during the pandemic lockdowns. And so he started this account, and people started writing in and asking him to try different spirits to taste. And he has a very good sense of humor. And so he was doing, gin and bourbon and everything. But then it got really heavy to people saying, like, try MALÖRT. And it's gotten so to the point where, like, most recently he did a thing where, like, he boiled hot dogs in MALÖRT and served like a kind of Chicago style hot dog, although not with all the time. But like the condiments were ketchup and mustard that were infused with MALÖRT. And then he made a MALÖRT martini, which is just so gross. He took the remnants of the hot dog water that he boiled the hot dog in, which was just MALÖRT. And then he shook that with ice and dry vermouth and made a martini. So, I mean, a lot of it's kind of like, they're like challenging him to kind of do stuff, but it's really fun. He's a fun account, and it will kind of describe to you what this tastes like. However, I will say, if you are ever at a bar and you see this behind the bar, I mean, go ahead and ask for a shot of it. I would, don't get more than a shot just to taste it, because it is kind of like a rite of passage for people who are in the cocktail world to have that. So I'm probably not going to finish that, to be quite honest. All right, let's talk about this cool album I was listening to. This is Sarah Vaughan and her trio. And this is from 1954, I believe it was. So parts of it were 1953. Oh, I guess some of it was 1957. And 1954. Anyway, the original album was called Swingin' Easy. Okay, and this is what the cover looked like. This is sort of a repressing. It's out of Europe. But what they did was they took the original album, which is this part here, and then they added this live broadcast from Birdland, very famous jazz club in New York, named after Charlie Parker, who they called Bird, and he used to play there. And so it's called Birdland. Anyway, huge connection to Charlie Parker here, and she played this concert here. So this album is it's fantastic. You guys know I don't listen to a ton of vocal jazz, but Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald, two of my famous favorites, rounded up by, I'd say, Billie Holiday being my top three female jazz vocalists. But this particular one, so much fun. So this song, lots of scatting. She's singing about her band and what instruments they're playing. It's just a fun tune that she actually helped write. She was a co-writer on that one. But as far as my favorites on here, All of Me is a great song where she does some really amazing vocal tricks where she drops, like at one point in the song, she drops like 2 full octaves in the same key and keeps singing. And it's just really cool to hear. And then They Can't Take That Away From Me. I love this version. So if you know that song, part of the lyrics are like, it's that, the way you hold your knife, the way you sip your tea, you can't take that away from me, that whole thing. There's a part of the song where the line is the way you sing off key. And when she sings that line at the second time, it happens twice. The first time she sings it straight. The second time when she sings that line, she actually forces herself to sing off key, which is actually way harder than you might think it is when you are a professional and used to singing in key. And in the middle of that line, just that one phrase, she sings it. And I'm not even going to attempt it. Just look it up. But she just does it. And it's such a simple little trick. But she's the only person I've ever heard sing the song that way. And the first time I heard it, I was just blown away. I was like, that is so cool. What a neat thing to do. And such an easy gag to make because it's right there in the line. And yet, I've never heard anybody do it. And I think because it's just actually really difficult to do. So I would recommend checking this out. Again, this is something that you could put on at night, late at night. You finish dinner, you're just sitting relaxing. Instead of turning on a TV, get out a book and put this on, or just sit and listen to it. Actually focus on the music. Maybe chat with a loved one or something, and have one of your favorite beverages. Probably not this, but check it out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. A few people have suggested that I should put clips of the music in my video when I'm doing that. I think that's copyright violation, but if you know different and know how I can do that, some people want to hear what the music is before they commit to it. So, which I understand. I just don't know how to do that without getting in trouble. But if you know, leave that in the comments below. And thank you so much for staying through the bonus content. I really, really appreciate it. And I particularly appreciate you watching the video. And if you could, watch a couple of these other videos here. And I will talk to you next time. I said I wasn't going to do this, but I will give you a final cheers. All right. Thanks again.